Excellent. I just want to read to you from Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14. For this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. We are continuing our Heroes of the Faith series. And before today, we've looked at Amy Carmichael and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, I don't know if you've heard any of those sermons. I heard Ken talking on Amy Carmichael, and I heard Harry talking on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I can thoroughly recommend both those talks. Do go listen if you haven't already listened. Today, we are looking at C.S. Lewis. And I want to read to you something from the inside sleeve of one of his books, just to give you a bit of background into C.S. Lewis. It says this: Clive Staples Lewis, 1898 to 1963, was one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century, and arguably the most influential Christian writer of his day. He was a fellow and tutor in English literature at Oxford University until 1954, when he was unanimously elected to the chair of medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge University, a position he held until his retirement. That's it. That's his CV. He didn't get called to the mission field. He wasn't martyred for his faith. He wasn't even imprisoned for his faith. He did volunteer to fight in the First World War because he thought it was his duty, and I consider that to be huge heroism. But that's really not the reason that we're talking about him as a hero today. So why are we talking about him? Well, this little biography goes on to say this: he wrote more than 30 books, allowing him to reach a vast audience, and his works continue to attract thousands of new readers every year. Amy Carmichael is an inspiration, but I doubt there's very many people outside the church who've heard of her. I think it's even less likely that people outside the church are reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But millions of people have read C.S. Lewis. But anyone who knows me will know that I very rarely give a sermon without quoting C.S. Lewis. So today, I'm definitely going to quote him. So I thought, well, let's just go in for it straight away. But just to make things a little bit interesting, we're going to do a quiz. Lewis or Swift? Okay? So I tried Slido, but I'm a dinosaur, so we're just going to do it this way. You're going to put your hands up if you think this quote was C.S. Lewis. Okay? Can we start with the first one? Who wrote this line? I would rather be consumed by you than fed by anyone else. Put your hands up if you think that was Lewis. Thank you. Next slide. You're right, it was Lewis. It was one of the talking horses in the Narnia stories talking to the lion, Aslan. But you'll be pleased to know the lion didn't eat the horse. Okay? Next one. Who used the phrase broken toys and faded flowers? Put your hands up if you think that was Lewis. You're wrong, it was. He used that phrase in the Four Loves. Next one, please, Seb. Who said, being in love is a good thing, but it's not the best thing? Put your hand up if you think that was Lewis. Yeah, you're right, it was Lewis. Next one, please. Who said you can't have a better tomorrow if you keep thinking about yesterday? Put your hands up if you think it was Lewis. Nah, that one actually was Taylor Swift. Okay, next one. Who said, love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken? Put your hands up if you think that was Lewis. Yeah, you're right, it was. Next one. Who said, we learnt the right steps to different dances? Put your hands up if you think that was Lewis. Most of you are completely correct, that was Taylor Swift. Next one. Who said, giving up doesn't always mean you're weak, sometimes you're just strong enough to let go? Put your hands up if you think that was Lewis. I'm afraid it was Swift. Who said, things never happen the same way twice? Lewis? You're not sure, are you? It was. And then who said this phrase, forcing laughter, faking smiles? Anyone for Lewis? No, you're right, that was Swift. And then finally, who said, oh no, not finally, we should love, not fall in love, because everything that falls gets broken. Anyone for Lewis? No, you're good at this, that was Swift. Who said, I did more than I thought. How could I forget a fairy tale? Was that Lewis? If you think it was, stick your hand up. You're right, that was Lewis. Who said, fearless is not the absence of fear, fearless is living in spite of those things that scare you. Put your hand up for Lewis. You're wrong, that was Swift. And who said, symbolism exists precisely for the purpose of conveying to the imagination what the intellect is not ready for? Bit of a trick question that, of course it was Lewis. But remember that one, because that one's important. So Lewis or Smith, do you think he would have approved? He does look rather uptight, doesn't he, when you see him with his buttoned-up shirt and tie. And I don't think it helps that all our photos of him are in black and white. But actually, Lewis had a reputation for having a great sense of humour. So I think he would have appreciated that. And he was a bit of a paradox in other ways, a bit of a contradiction. He was a world-class academic and scholar. Yet, he's best known for his children's stories. He was a man who made a marriage of convenience to stop a colleague being deported back to the States. Yet he was a lover plunged into deep and desperate grief when his wife died. He was an apologist whose words, arguments, explanations, and metaphors have taught so many so much about God. Yet a philosopher theologian who believed that words were inadequate to describe the divine. He was a classically public school and Oxford educated dead white man from the last century. Yet he spoke truth that would resonate with a modern generation of Swifties, and he wrote stories that can lead a child into the presence of Christ. I was 12. It was my first term at senior school, and the class reading book was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Thanks, Emma. I loved it. I loved the story, I loved the characters, I wanted to be Lucy, but most of all, I loved Aslan. I found out that there was more than one book in the series. I asked for and was given the box set for Christmas that year. This set of books is closer to 50 years old than I would like to think. It's been well read and well loved and is still one of the best gifts I was ever given. I got to the end of the book. I got to the end of the last book, and I felt that desolation that all avid readers feel when they get to the end of a great series. And I remember to this day lying in my bed, wishing with all my heart that Aslan was real. And I heard a voice clearly in my head, not audibly, but in my head, saying, "I am." And I remembered that bit in the last battle where Aslan says to the children, "You can know me in your world, but it will be by a different name." And then I started thinking, and I don't recall that anybody up till that point had told me that it was an allegorical tale, that Aslan represented Christ, but I worked it out. The great excitement of realizing that Aslan was Christ. And I fell in love with Christ through Aslan. Lewis's words are powerful. But why? Lewis was essentially trained in thought. He studied classics and philosophy. He loved logic, and he had a razor-sharp mind. As a youth, he studied under a tutor who never, ever let him get away with a casual comment. He had to justify every opinion, and he thrived on it. But Lewis also studied poetry, myth, legend. He acknowledged the power of imagination. He was a world expert in medieval literature and thought, and therefore knew that external influences can affect our lives according to the orientation of our hearts, not simply our minds. He knew the difference between facts and truth, the difference between information and wisdom. Could I have the next slide, please, Seb? And the next one. He said symbolism exists precisely for the purpose of conveying to the imagination what the intellect is not ready for. He conveyed Christ to me through my imagination, and I fell in love with Christ in a way that I had not done through just the intellectual knowledge of the life of Christ. Next slide, please, Seb. So every argument was carefully considered and crafted and boldly spoken. He appealed to both faith and imagination to get his message across. He was not ashamed of his faith. And yet, he was a reluctant convert to Christianity. However, he weighed the evidence and reasoned that he could not ignore it. He himself said that if Christianity was wrong, it was of no importance. But if it was right, it was of utmost importance. Lewis may not have been called to the mission field or martyred for his faith, but he counted the cost of discipleship before he committed, and he knew obedience wasn't optional. Just as Amy Carmichael and Dietrich Bonhoeffer knew. Therefore, when he committed, he was expecting to follow Christ, but out of duty. He was famously surprised by joy. Thought brought him to the foot of the cross. Experience of the living God transformed him. Lewis subsequently said that coming to know God is not like learning a new subject, but like breathing a new atmosphere. We hear stories like that of Amy Carmichael and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Corrie ten Boom and Mother Teresa, and we can be overwhelmed by the thought of the cost. How much effort it would take for us to follow like that. But we forget that their oxygen was the living God. Lewis understood that there were two ways of knowing: reasoning, analysis. Next slide, please, Seb. Reasoning, analysis, contemplation, looking at, knowing about something. But there is also, next slide, experience, the tasting of, inhabiting, enjoying, dwelling with, or within something. And Lewis illustrates this in his essay, Meditations in a Tool Shed. First, he contemplates a beam of light in a dark tool shed, dust motes and all. But then he says this: "Then I moved so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no tool shed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside, and beyond that, 90-odd million miles away, the sun." The beam no longer comprised an object for contemplation, but became the light by which he saw. And that's why I picked the passage in Ephesians, because I think Lewis and all the other heroes in this series were not acting on intellectual reasoning or self-willed duty to serve. They served because they were strengthened by power in their inner being, because Christ dwelt in their hearts. They were rooted and established in love, and they knew through experience that love that surpasses mere knowledge. They had stepped into the beam, and so can we. How? Well, why not start by praying that prayer in Ephesians for yourself, or asking someone else to pray it for you, our prayer team will be available at the end of the service and will be delighted to pray that for you or any other prayer that you need. And then, just why not? You could do worse than reread The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and ask Christ to reveal himself to you through that wonderful story. Thank you.